To begin this evening's program, we're going to be hearing from Bergey. Bergey joined the NEA in 1985 as a senior arts specialist after having served as the state folk arts coordinator in the state of Missouri. In 2001, he became the director of folk and traditional arts at the NEA. In addition to overseeing the NEA's grant making in this area, Bergey also manages the National Heritage Fellowships, the nation's highest honor for artists working in the folk and traditional arts, and provides ongoing counsel to the U.S. Department of State in international cultural policy issues. In addition, Bergey has served as a field worker, festival organizer, radio producer, curator, and arts administrator. In short, Bergey has pretty much done it all. So please put your hands together and help me welcome our first presenter this evening, Bergey.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here and to speak about folk and traditional arts and the National Endowment for the Arts. I was at a meeting in California last week with Kurt Dewhurst and Marcia McDowell, and we were talking a little bit. They're the guiding lights of the Michigan Traditional Arts Program, and we were talking a little bit about this Friday and about the NEA and its role in traditional arts. And Marcia mentioned that their program has received over the course of a number of years, about 40 years, 60 grants from the NEA. And she described those grants as transformative. And I've heard that word several times already this evening, but I think that's a good word for what happens with NEA funding, or at least that's what we hope will happen. And I can speak a bit from personal experience, because while Kurt and Marcia were developing a program here in Michigan in the mid-1970s, a group of us a little bit to the south in Missouri were doing the same thing. And we had an idea that there were lots of artists in Missouri and the Ozarks in that region that were not being recognized, appreciated, or for that matter, heard. And we thought that we'd just like to do a little bit of field work, a little bit of recording. We'd like to put out an album if we could, just to draw attention to it. We don't really know how to do that. At the time, there wasn't a folk arts program at the state level. In fact, there wasn't even a folk arts program at the NEA. But I did know there was one person who was working at NEA who was a folklorist and who had some experience with old-time music. So I decided to go out and to visit him to see whether it might be possible to get a little money. And I was greeted in Washington with an open door and a friendly face and some encouragement. And so we applied to the NEA, and lo and behold, much to our surprise, we got a grand total of $4,500 to do the work. And we thought that was big money then. And it was not so much the money that mattered to us, but it was that someone in Washington really cared about what we were doing and encouraged us to continue it. And that meant all the world to us, and it evolved into a program that involved festivals and other activities. But more than anything else, that changed my life. Now, the histories of NEA and the Michigan Traditional Arts Program are inextricably entwined, really. Michigan Traditional Arts is one of the earliest statewide folk arts programs, and it continues to be a national model. It fulfills what I consider to be the four cornerstones of an effective cultural heritage program: cultural discovery, cultural democracy, cultural development, and cultural diplomacy. Let me speak about each of these for just a minute. Cultural discovery constitutes the ongoing fieldwork that identifies artistic resources in a state or region. Fieldwork and research were initiated at the very inception of the Michigan program in 1975 and led to its first public program, an exhibition of folk art. To this day, serious research and fieldwork, or what I like to call cultural discovery, inform the public programming at Michigan Traditional Arts. Cultural democracy addresses the ever-evolving and diverse expressive life of our nation. This approach is manifest in such programs as the Great Lakes Folk Festival, a free festival here that presents to the general public the depth and range of the region's community-based artistic traditions. I had the pleasure of attending the first model for that festival. It was called Michigan Whose Story? ? And indeed, the Great Lakes Folk Festival, following its run as a national folk festival, has become an ongoing story of the state's vibrant and diverse artistic traditions. Cultural development fulfills the potential for traditional arts to inform our sense of ourselves and to assure that living traditions can be maintained. Through the Michigan Arts and Education Program, known as Folk Patterns, a collaboration with the 4-H and Cooperative Extension Service initiated in 1977, young people have been exposed to the theory and practice of folk arts. Through the Traditional Arts Apprenticeship Program, master artists have taught the knowledge and skills of the traditional arts. By my calculation, well over 200 apprenticeships in traditional arts have been carried out by the Michigan program. Finally, the opportunity for cultural diplomacy. Through collaborative programs in China and South Africa, the Michigan program has carried out exchanges of ideas and the sharing of artistic work. Most recently, the beautiful Chinese quilt exhibit on view at the MSU Museum. How then was all this possible? I mentioned that there was no program at the NEA for folk arts when I went there in 1974. Well, in 1977, Bess Lomax Hawes, a member of the legendary Lomax family, came to the NEA, and she developed a program. And it led to the establishment of an infrastructure of statewide folk arts programs, the development of state folk arts apprenticeship programs, and funding support for public folk programs such as exhibitions, festivals, and media presentations. In 1982, she initiated the National Heritage Fellowship Program. This is the highest form of federal recognition of folk artists. I have to say that the best week of my year as director of the folk arts program at NEA was when I got to call those artists and let them know that they had gotten a National Heritage Fellowship. My colleague Dan Sheehy told a story once of calling Johnny Gimble, a fiddler from Texas, to tell him he got a National Heritage Fellowship, and he said, and by the way, Johnny, there's a $10,000 award that comes with the fellowship. And there was quite a long silence on the phone. And finally, Johnny said, well, tell me just one thing. He says, do I have to pay it back all at one time, or can I pay back in installments? But that's the pleasure of letting people know that good news. Approaching its 35th anniversary, that is the National Heritage Fellowships, Michigan artists have been honored in each of the 4 decades of the program's existence. I believe we can learn something about cultural value and the characteristics and the character of master traditional artists in taking a look at these Michigan artists. Artistic excellence is a thread that binds all of the artists who have become National Heritage Fellows. In the interest of time, I'm going to just speak about a few of them. The first recipient from Michigan was Wade Maynor from Flint. That was in 1987. He was born in North Carolina. He grew up around Appalachian musicians and began playing banjos and string bands. Between 1935 and 1941, he and his brother J.E., sometimes together and sometimes in separate bands, recorded over 165 songs for the RCA Victor label and made numerous appearances on local radio stations. Those became seminal recordings in old-time music history, predating what we now know as bluegrass music. In 1953, Maynor moved to Flint to work in the GM plant and continued to play music, but only among family and friends. But in the 1970s, with the revival of interest in folk music, his work was rediscovered, and he was featured on new recordings and made appearances at public festivals. Wade Maynor's story is one both of excellence and cultural continuity. In fact, in 2007, I traveled to Flint to attend his 100th birthday celebration, where he and his wife performed for a large crowd of admirers and friends. Howard Armstrong, a 1990 Heritage Fellow, provides a lesson in cultural creativity. Like Wade Maynor, Armstrong was born in a rural setting in the Mid-South in Tennessee. He was performing in string bands, and by his mid-teens, he was traveling around Virginia, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Kentucky, entertaining miners and steelworkers. But during World War II, he moved north to Detroit to work in the auto plants. But he continued to adapt his African-American musical roots to suit audiences of the various urban ethnic groups that had settled in Detroit and Chicago. Eventually, he was able to sing and communicate in 8 languages. In addition, he expressed himself through the visual arts, painting, creating what today we would call graphic novels, and even designing the juke joint used in the movie The Color Purple. Another recipient was Art Moilanen of Mass City, Michigan. Art's parents came to the UP from northern Finland, as did so many immigrants in the late 19th and early 20th century, to work in the copper mines. Moilanen took up the accordion in his youth. Although he worked as a logger, he played for dances and family gatherings. When he retired for logging, he purchased a bar in Mass City and continued to play his music. Mr. Moilanen, throughout his lifetime, provided the social soundtrack for the community of Finnish Americans in the UP. His is a lesson in the value of cultural community, continuity, creativity, and community, all attributes that define the National Heritage Fellowship Program.